Okay, the focus of this video is going to be on the Second Crusade, one that I think a lot of people find quite difficult, kind of gets forgotten a bit. You've got the the extraordinary story of the First Crusade, and then you have the Richard the Lionheart and Saladin on the Third Crusade, and the Second Crusade doesn't really have the same kind of obvious figures or great heroic storylines, so it can get forgotten, but is very, very important in terms of our coursework and in terms of an understanding of how crusading changes over time. The first thing to say is about why the Second Crusade was launched. It was launched in response to Zengi taking Edessa. I think that's interesting straight away, because what we're talking about here is, whereas the First Crusade you could argue was quite proactive, Urban II launching the Crusade, in this one certainly it's a response to Muslim aggression. It's a response to Edessa being taken. Edessa was the first Crusader state. It was a Christian city even before the Crusaders had arrived. It was an Eastern Christian city before. So its loss did seemingly cause some shock. So the Second Crusade was launched. The launching of that Second Crusade, though, is critical. There are three major players here, and there's a real argument as to why the Second Crusade got off the ground. And the reason why that's important is because if you think it was if you think it was Eugenius, then it adds a lot of weight to the argument that the papacy were responsible for launching crusades and changing the nature of crusades. If you think it was Louis VII, then again it starts to point towards the monarchs. Or if you think it was Bernard of Clairvaux, then perhaps you could use that as an argument to say that the papacy were still important. Or you might see kind of these alternative preachers like Peter the Hermit in the First Crusade and Bernard of Clairvaux with the Second Crusade as taking crusading in a new direction. So the arguments are that, well, first of all, Eugenius over here he is responsible for launching the crusade because he issues the papal bull. It's the first very clear papal bull to launch a crusade. Urban II used speech. Eugenius III uses a papal bull. That's an encyclical. It's a letter that's going to be sent out around Christendom. So this is an example straight away, isn't it, of the papacy changing crusading. They've learnt the lessons from the First Crusade, that Chinese whisper idea and so on, and now they're trying to ensure that the message is conveyed with clarity. Quantum predecessors, however, is quite interesting, because although, yes, it represents a change, the very nature of this call to the Crusades was that it harks back to the successes of the First Crusade. I think it's Barclay, I'll have to check that name, I think it's Barclay who uses the line that the Second Crusade was constantly looking over its shoulder at the successes of the First Crusade, and right from the start, predecessors, the focus is on repeating the work of the ancestors. Either way, Eugenius III launches the papal bull, so maybe therefore he is the most important reason. Certainly Phillips argues that the papacy were critical in starting the Second Crusade. The other argument, however, is that Louis VII, he's up here, Louis VII was actually responsible for launching the Second Crusade. He had already made some form of commitment to go on crusades a couple of years before that, and at his Christmas court at Bruges, he had talked about and tried to convince some of his nobles to go on crusade. So there is this suggestion that Louis had kind of independently reached the conclusion he'd like to go on the crusade. However, Bourges, not Bruges. However, he is unsuccessful because, according to Phillips, the nobility are waiting for Eugenius's papal bull to arrive. So maybe the argument here is that neither were able to launch a crusade without the other. The final element of this is that maybe it was down to Bernard of Clairvaux. It was when Bernard of Clairvaux travelled to Vézelay in 1147 and preached to the court. 1145, and preached to the court at Vézelay that the crusade actually got off the ground. Louis VII takes the cross, and then his nobles follow suit. So we've got all kinds of implications in terms of recruitment, who was more important in terms of recruitment, but just generally, who was responsible for launching the crusade? Was it Bernard, the moral ombudsman of Europe at the time? That he's one of the leading theologian of his age, almost a celebrity of sorts. Was it Eugenius, Bernard's former pupil, or was it Louis VII? Either way, the crusade is launched. However, before the crusade gets off the ground, there's another element of controversy. There's anti-Semitism again, as we saw on the first crusade, but also Bernard of Clairvaux is drawn over to Germany, partly to crush some anti-Semitism that's taking place, and he does so successfully. Interesting that he is successful where Urban II wasn't. But secondly, he then approaches Conrad III, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, it is thought, and there is evidence to suggest, that Eugenius did not want German involvement in this crusade. He had envisaged it to be a French-led operation and did not want Conrad involved. But Bernard goes ahead and, preaching to Conrad, he persuades him to take the cross. Conrad breaks down in tears and takes the cross. So collectively this is significant. Conrad III, Louis VII, now we have two major monarchs on crusade for the first time. Immediately it brings about differences. As Asbridge says, recruitment was buoyed. Straight away they bring with them all of their entourage. So recruitment was buoyed. And also, of course, they have access to finance that the crusade leaders of the first crusade would never have had. So the implications of the monarchs taking the cross were as follows. There was better planning. So there were staggered departures to make sure that they weren't moving through the same areas at the same time and driving up prices. They arranged for markets to be so that they weren't having the same problems as the first crusade, again in terms of prices. And they had the financial support of the crown. It's thought Conrad III largely seemed to pay for it through his own wealth and his own income, his own imperial income. Louis VII, there is evidence to suggest that he had formed a levy. He had called a levy, and it was actually some form of taxation. It's not clear quite what, but some form of taxation. So clearly, straight away, the monarchs having an impact in terms of allowing for the nature of crusading to change by bringing those additional resources and perhaps that better planning. In terms of recruitment, as I say, it was significant. The feudal system, straight away, we can start to see that having an impact. If the emperor or the king takes the cross, then their leading knights and nobles will probably go with them, and it has a knock-on effect down the chain. The hierarchical nature of medieval society, as Asbridge said, meant that it triggered a chain reaction. There is a question as to whether they were able to restrict non-combatants. Certainly they intended to, and certainly Eugenius tried to in Quantum Predecessors, but they weren't entirely successful. Conrad in particular really struggled with this and was unable to ensure that the non-combatants weren't coming along with him. In fact, there were times when he tried to separate them from the main army, but because they were travelling into Asia Minor, they wanted to be with an armed force. So it's still non-combatants, just as they were on the First Crusade, causing problems on the Second Crusade. Another key element of this is that it does seem to be, if the monarchs have taken the cross and people are following them, who are they loyal to? Has the nature of crusading changed in that respect? Is there still loyalty to the papacy and the papacy's purpose? There is evidence to suggest that loyalty seemed to be primarily with the monarchs during the Second Crusade. There's a song, a troubadour song from the time, Who Goes Along with King Louis, makes no mention of the papacy, but it's talking about going along with King Louis on his crusade. Okay, Just going back to non-combatants, I'd forgotten I'd said this. I mentioned that there were still problems. A key source for this is Odo of Douai, who accompanied Louis VII on his crusade. He was Louis VII's chaplain. Great source for the Second Crusade. He is very explicit about the problems of non-combatants, and he writes very clearly about the fact that these have held up the campaign. The reason that's quite interesting is because when you look at Richard I with the Third Crusade, Frederick Barbarossa, Philip II, they are insistent that non-combatants don't attend. So perhaps there is just this sense of learning from the experience of previous crusades, and Odo of Douai's account obviously influences future crusades. Anyway, Second Crusade itself. The other really interesting element of the Second Crusade is that the purpose undoubtedly shifts. Obviously, the purpose isn't to take Jerusalem, but there is still an emphasis on the Holy Land. So we can certainly say that there is still an emphasis on the Holy Land during the Second Crusade, and we'll focus on this thread first of all. Conrad and Louis obviously head over to the Holy Land. Conrad is defeated very early in Asia Minor, is injured himself, returns to Constantinople, and ends up joining Louis VII. By the time Louis VII limps his way to the Holy Land, having had a terrible time through the Italian mountains and only rescued really by the Templars, interesting to see that they are having an impact on crusading now. They supported the march and helped to get them through hostile territory. When they eventually arrive in the Holy Land, they obviously face a decision. Well, where do they go? The papal target was initially Edessa. Having said that, quite a lot of the preaching, and certainly Bernard's preaching, doesn't tend to mention Edessa specifically. And it tends to talk about the need to defend the holy city. So maybe the focus is still on Jerusalem, perhaps. And even though it's defending Jerusalem, the focus is still there. There's a couple of interesting elements here. Is that first of all, they decide not to attack Edessa. Louis travels down to Jerusalem, and a council is held in Jerusalem. Now this is interesting because this is evidence that the settlers were therefore having an impact on decision making. The settlers were perhaps helping to dictate the purpose, or at least the strategy that the Crusaders are adopting. What is clear is that the papal target has been overridden, and perhaps this is something, this is a theme that actually once on the Crusade, the monarchs, in this case, perhaps in conjunction with the settlers, were making their own decision. Either way, it led to a huge failure. The attack on Damascus was a failure, and they returned to Europe. That is significant in a number of ways. Most prominently, that the popularity of crusading declined in the aftermath of the Second Crusade. A bit like after 1101 earlier on, it led to a period where there was very little crusading activity, known as the Fallow period, more of which later on. For Bernard of Clairvaux, it was a source of great embarrassment. He issues an apology of sorts. It's called the Apologia, and he says, "I would rather men muttered against me than against God." But within his apology, he makes the point that actually the Crusaders did not go out there with the purity of intentions that was necessary. So, but either way, it's a disaster. Shockwaves felt in Europe. There are some really quite severe sources that are written to criticise the initiators of the Second Crusade. There was clearly a lot of anger felt in Europe about the failure of the Crusade, that people had been misled, according to some of the sources. Okay, so there's the issue with the Holy Land. So we can see evidence of the monarchs changing crusading, shifting the purpose, the settlers shifting the purpose of crusading. But that isn't the whole story of the Second Crusade. For the first time during the Second Crusade, the scope of crusading widens. So under one banner, under the banner of the Second Crusade, there are actually three different campaigns being launched. The Holy Land, which we've mentioned already, and the one that most people were aware of. Secondly, though, the Iberian Peninsula, i.e. Spain. So we've also got a major campaign being launched in Spain. And actually, it provides the only major source of success. It's approved by the papacy.